Good morning. My name is Will Kirby. I'm a project manager with HDR and Renewable Energy, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers and panelists this morning for the state of national solar, starting with Gretchen Dolson, as John just mentioned. Gretchen, as the Renewable Energy Practice Lead for HDR, she's focused on maximizing technical excellence and developing opportunities for wind and solar energy around the country. She's managed more than 3,000 megawatts of renewable energy projects throughout her career, and has helped our teams develop thousands more. Throughout her career, she's led projects ranging from solar, wind, and landfill gas to energy facilities. She gives back and participates in the industry through active involvement with SEPA, OEA, PowerGen, and the Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy. And Gretchen is a resident of Lincoln here and was an active participant on the committee, which has now been delegated or downgraded to me. Also joining Gretchen up here today will be Molly Brown. She's the VP of Energy Development with GenPro Energy Solutions based out of Piedmont, South Dakota, which I think is hovering right around 0 this morning, and multiple feet of snow, or have, yeah. So she gets to return to that later this afternoon, so when you're pitying yourself, think about Molly. Her background in quantitative economics has allowed her to see and create market opportunities in underdeveloped regions. After being promoted to VP of Energy Production, GenPro has shot up the solar power world's top solar contractor list. In Nebraska and South Dakota, Molly has been involved in many firsts. She's developed and project managed the first muni utility solar farm for the city of Lexington. She's also overseen the construction of 2 pilot projects with NPPD's Sunwise Community Solar Program. In South Dakota, she works with clients such as Black Hills State University, the South Dakota National Guard, the Lower Bruley Sioux Tribe, and others. Molly is currently actively developing projects in 10 states and 5 countries while managing EPC work for the GenPro service team. This year, her team will construct systems in Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, Maryland, Turks and Caicos, and the Bahamas. Fingers crossed, and we're still waiting for our request to participate on that. So I want to go ahead and welcome Gretchen and Molly.
So good morning, everyone. A lot of the last day has been spent on the big boys, OPPD, NPPD, and LES. And I actually wanted to take a little bit of time to recognize the muni utilities who have really been promoting solar on the ground level. So in this state, these are the following communities that have done solar on a municipal level: Lexington, Gordon, Fremont, South Sioux City, Hastings, which their system just went online in the past month, so that's a great project. Grand Island, Superior, Gothenburg, Aurora, Schuyler, Central City, Atkinson. Hemingford is just starting construction right now. Norfolk is going to be starting construction next year. Scottsbluff is in construction right now. And the first MEAN community, which is the Municipal Energy Alliance of Nebraska, will be starting construction earlier next year. So there's a lot of communities that really are doing something that are outside of the big boys, and I just wanted to take some time to recognize those people because you are all doing a great job.
So the state of the solar industry, I'm going to start with large scale. I'm going to start with what's going on in the national purview. I'm going to talk about a couple of different regions of the country that are not the North Central. I'm going to do that to give you some examples of how varied this market is on a national basis and why solar compared to wind appears so scattered and disorganized. And then I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about Nebraska and some of the trends I see coming and some of the things to be watching for. So I think maybe Kathy mentioned yesterday, and some of the CEOs also talked about what's going on with plant closures. If you see what's behind me here, you'll see that there's a significant amount of fossil generation fossil and nuclear that's going to be shutting down over the next year. Or this actually was the 2019 estimate from the Energy Association, from the government. Then look at those additions. You have 8 gigawatt of planned retirements. You have 24 of new generation coming. Look at that new generation mix. Look at it compared to what's shutting down. That's a very good indicator nationally of what's going on. It's a series of policies. A lot of times it's economics, and sometimes it's politics. So I'm going to turn my back to you guys, and I will apologize for that. Just look past me for the slides. So this is some of the annual capacity. What I'll tell you is these numbers were based upon December 31st of 2018. These numbers come from SEPA, Smart Electric Power Alliance. These are already out of date. This is the best estimate that we had. It's an easy slide for me to show. What you'll see is where the hot rear areas are. It's the Carolinas, it's New York, it's Texas and California, and the West. Primarily dominated by utility scale in the West, primarily dominated by what we call CNI or MUSH. CNI is commercial and industrial. MUSH is the municipals that Molly's talking about, the universities, the schools, the hospitals. So there are a lot of what I will call institutional organizations. CNI tends to be industrial type customers, and MUSH tends to be institutional. There's a lot of that in the Northeast. And then in the Southeast, you really have a hybrid blend. You have some, and a lot of that stuff, I'll get to that in a minute, but a lot of it is a blend of there's some utility scale and some smaller scale. So, annual growth. So I've been designing and installing solar systems since 2008. It's been a crazy, crazy ride. It's been a lot of fun. It's a different, very similar to what we experienced in the late 90s on the wind side, and then again in the 2006 to 2009 timeframe on the wind side. Exponential growth. What you'll see is a variety: residential, non-residential, and utility scale solar. It takes an awful lot of residential scale solar. Think in Nebraska, you have a 25 kW net metering cap for residential. Basically, if you want a net meter, right? That's the easiest way to do something like that. That's a pretty small system when you compare to a 200 megawatt solar facility on the utility side. So you can see why the numbers are skewed that way, particularly in the West. But what actually is amazing, I'll have a California graphic, and I'll talk a little bit about that distributed piece later. What's interesting, there actually is a pretty good spread between residential, CNI MUSH, municipal, and the utility scale. So what are some of the business entities? A lot of utility folks here in the room, a lot of folks who work with the utilities in the room. Where is solar starting to impact the rest of the decision-making in a utility? This isn't just about generation. This is about how they are, what their long-term gas and coal purchase contracts are. It impacts that. It impacts demand-side management. As they're dealing with electric vehicles and they have to figure out how they're going to do the load balancing, there was some discussion about that yesterday. Solar influences that, and how you implement solar influences that. And quite frankly, we're seeing it vary all over the country. What they're doing in California is different from what they're doing in New York, and it's different from what they're doing in Minnesota. Minnesota. Did I get that right, Justin? So let's talk public power. There's good data out there. Best data exists for some of the IOUs, investor-owned utilities. That's not the state of Nebraska. Public power. I'm born and raised here in Nebraska. I'm a Kearney kid. I've lived in Lincoln for the last 25 years. I believe very strongly in public power. I'm a huge supporter of it. It's fun when I travel nationally. I get to work with a lot of for-profit utilities. I say everybody's for-profit in some way, sense, or form, but it's a different mindset, right? It's the stakeholder mindset versus what I love about public power is the true intent of the benefit of the citizens of this state. It's a real value that we have in this state, and I think they do a pretty good job of implementing these programs with kind of a push-pull. They're doing good things, but they're not going too fast. It's an important concept to have. This chart is skewed by, there are some folks like TVA, which is also effectively a public power institution. They have a large number of PPAs that are solar. They're skewing the number a little bit. Otherwise, it's a pretty good reflection. It's a pretty good balance. And if you look, it's pretty well matched up with that. We talked about the 2019 mix of residential, CNI MUSH, and utility scale. You see a similar crossover in the public power space. So we talk about how public power is different from an economic financing standpoint. It's really not. It's a different means to an end, but the results, we're seeing very similar results. I'm going to talk about the Northeast a little bit. The Northeast is a good market to be familiar with. It is very different from the North. I'll call it North Central, which I consider Nebraska. Nebraska is a part of the North Central market. It's very different. It is primarily because of land, because of how hard it is to permit, because of the mass humanity in the Northeast, and there just isn't sufficient land available. It tends to be more C&I, commercial and industrial, or MUSH. It's a lot of municipal utilities, it's a lot of school systems, it's a lot of hospitals that are wanting to implement this, and it's more from a cost reduction, energy efficiency than a let's reduce carbon or let's have 100% renewables. So it's a different driver in that market. There are some other things in that market with energy storage. I live in that space as well. There's a lot of storage, and it's because they monetize some what we call ancillary services. So it's that grid stabilization, frequency control, shifting the demand curve, the load curve. Those are things that they do with battery storage that they can monetize in the Northeast that we currently don't do in SPP. The other main reason that I want to point out there is exceptionally limited transmission in the Northeast. It is completely over-constrained, and so it's almost impossible to get. If you want to put a 200 megawatt facility on, it's almost impossible to get. Interestingly enough, the growth area in the Northeast, it's offshore wind. The Southeast. Southeast is an interesting animal. I have little kids, so I can use that word. And there is no RTO in the Southeast. It's primarily dominated by just a couple of very large, politically influential IOUs. I work with those groups. They're really good. They're really good guys, actually. Have similar approaches to their clients, even though they have a different economic driver than what we do as public power. But it leads to a different approach. A lot of the focus, the reason for solar in the Southeast, and here's where it relates to Nebraska. It's economic development driven. Think about the large solar opportunities in the next 18 months in the state of Nebraska. They are to a large extent going to be driven by economic development opportunities that create additional load demand for the utilities. That makes sense to everybody? Okay. That's why the Southeast is important, a good model to understand for folks in Nebraska. It's gone very well. There's great opportunities. I work with co-ops down there that take advantage of this and help customers out. I've worked with some of the large IOUs down there to help some of this. We were able to move these large projects forward, large projects being 100 and 200 megawatt solar facilities. And there are absolutely land challenges down there. It's a forestry area, right? You have hurricanes, you have hills, you have sinkholes, you have tons of trees, different wildlife, different constraints and challenges than what you have in Nebraska. But nonetheless, there's a lot of good things going on there as well. On the distributed solar side, what we're seeing it primarily being used with demand-side management and trying to figure out how they're going to balance some of the localized grids a little bit more. There's some good pilot studies some of the IOUs are doing as part of their grid modernization and microgrid programs that solar and battery are big components of. Those are the types of things that I see as good examples for the future market here in Nebraska as we evolve, regardless of the size of the town. California, well, we all hear about California and all these great things they do and all the solar they're putting in. And if you look, it's amazing participating in that yellow trend. That's that utility scale trend in California and as it grows. What has that done? That not only that market, but they call it it's a C&I scale, so it's a 10 megawatt and less scale, but there's an unbelievable number of those facilities that go in California, and because they can put them on their distribution system. Their transmission system is pretty well tapped out. They're trying to do some growth, and as you've all heard from PG, they have some transmission issues. So a lot of that growth is now going on that distribution system. It's leading to some interesting changes. They now are trying to model their distribution system, just like at the SPP, they have their day-ahead market, and they're modeling their transmission system and looking at the load balancing. California is now doing that in certain places in their distribution system as well. That's something that we can anticipate to see in Nebraska in the future. That's going to make it easier for some of the smaller projects to go and monetize. It's also going to make it harder for some of those small projects to go and monetize because of the controls and the additional investments you need to make so you can monitor those. Community choice aggregation, it's an interesting political thing. That's probably all I will say on that. Again, what I like about Nebraska is we work, the utilities, the citizens, the state legislatures, we really do work pretty well together. I'm sure we all have our idiosyncrasies and opinions on that, and at the end of the day, I think we all talk pretty well compared to a lot of states I work with. Sometime we could talk horror stories about California or North Carolina or some other places. It's interesting. We are nice. And then the other is going to be the long term. I don't know where it's going to go with that long-term consequence of the fires and PGE's change in operational directive for shutting down lines to protect from that. A multi-billion lawsuit payout settlement has a big impact on your operations and how that's going to ripple through not only the utility industry, but even the private industry and the IPPs. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays in the next 18 months and how it impacts future work here in Nebraska. And I don't know what that answer is going to be. So Nebraska, why do we care about the rest of it? What about Nebraska? I see it being kind of like the Southeast. I see a lot of economic development driving some of the large facilities that are coming into this state. We've done a nice job of bringing wind into this state. We have not necessarily focused on solar. It's a different land use mix. Instead of having 20,000 acres where you're going to take, at the end of the day, you have a single acre in every section being used. Once it's complete, you have an entire section being used. So you're taking a section out instead of pieces and parts. It's a different type of visual impact. If somebody says there's no NIMBY in solar, they're lying to you. There is NIMBY in solar, but it is a different type of NIMBY. If someone wants to tell you that you don't have to monitor these like you do a wind farm and you don't have to O&M them like a wind farm, I would disagree with them. But it's a different type of O&M. It's a different type of monetization. It's a different type of staffing, and that has a different kind of economic benefit for the communities in those areas that this goes through. That's what we've seen on things. You do have to maintain the vegetation on these sites. It's a legitimate thing. We can plant fescue. We can plant pollinators. This is the state of Nebraska. We have a lot of overblow seeds. So in 4 or 5 years, you either have to revegetate or you need to think about what your life cycle vegetation plan is on these. Coincidentally, this is an old graphic. It only has the 16. I think we were at 29 last I saw in the numbers. But again, look at the balance. Some residential, some C&I, some mostly a lot of, and then what we call utility scale. I'm going to say this utility scale is not the kind of utility scale I'm used to working in. This is the 5 megawatt utility scale, and that is no offense to anyone in this room, but pretty quickly that number is going to be very skewed by the first 200 megawatt facility that goes in. System plan analysis. Okay. I'll speed up a little bit so that we can get to some questions. Some of the big trends, some of the big things that people need to be thinking about as they're developing sites. Those of you that are IPPs in the room, you already know this. Those of you that are utilities, you already know this. Those of you that are not either of those and you're here to learn, these are the types of business decisions, technical decisions that all of the entities involved in these projects have to make. It is not any one thing that makes or breaks a solar project. What's kind of interesting is a solar project is different from wind, and that think of it as tinker toys. You have an inverter, you have a panel, you have a rack, you have a vegetation plan, you have grading, you have a site, you have wetlands. That is a little bit different because it's a mass area. Lots of inputs and variables that go into the actual production on a site. Versus a wind facility that if you site it correct, you site it a certain way to begin with, you basically have one turbine and it's based on the wind. There's a lot of things that can impact this on the solar side. Not a big deal, it's just more tinker toys. You have more pieces and parts to bring together. It also doesn't necessarily mean it's higher O&M. The O&M on these is actually pretty straightforward. It's very, very simple, very straightforward. But it is in that initial planning process where you can really impact your production by the equipment that you select. So what are some of the hot topics? Water. Oh my goodness, water, 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 water. We are not the only state that cares about our water. And a lot of states, it's water quality, not quantity, that is the hot item. The interconnectedness, most states that are not looking at the interconnectedness of surface water and groundwater, that can be an issue. It's something to think about. IPPs need to be aware of when they come to Nebraska. Dealing with those constraints, having a project site getting shut down because the whooping crane was in Kearney this week, right? What does that mean? It's a 24-hour thing, but we still need to do it. That does occur in other places. In California, it's the kit fox. In Georgia, it's an alligator. Those are lovely. But those are very common things we'll see. Stakeholder outreach, public outreach, again, I'm going to tell you, NIMBY doesn't, it's not that NIMBY doesn't exist here, it's that it's just different. Very common to hear when we go to a conditional use or a special use meeting, it's not that I don't support solar, I just don't want to look at it. Have you heard that before? I think we've heard that before, right? Consider O&M needs. One of the things as we're developing sites in Nebraska that I would encourage if there's any building code agency folks here is to be considering the overall life cycle O&M of a facility. Building code and the current codes do not necessarily, shall we say, incentivize good life cycle preparation on a project. But they impact two things. They impact the profitability long-term of a project for whoever owns it, and they can impact the safety of the facility. Generally in solar's kind of like wind. If there's a fire, if it's a fire with solar, it's contain and let it burn. That's the current firefighting operation. That's what insurance is for. Particularly if there's a battery on site, you simply contain it, keep it from spreading, and you let it burn. That is the acceptable kind of national standard for how we deal with these facilities. California has taken a little bit different approach to some of that. What they have found is the dollars that they're spending are not showing increased benefits in the results. And then consider the fire access requirements, particularly with the battery. When you have a rural volunteer fire department and you have a battery out there, by the time they get there, it's already a total loss. So it's really about protecting the surrounding properties and protecting them than it is the facility itself. And that's okay. Again, that should be monetized in these projects. I think there's 2 points I'll make on these comments and then want to open it up for questions. And one is the or equal that I have on the bottom. There's a lot of folks who are going to be coming to the state of Nebraska with the increased opportunities in solar. And they have been installing solar nationally for 5 years, for 10 years. By and large, the contractors in this industry, the developers in this industry are very, very good. They are competent, they are focused on safety, and they really do quality work. There are a few. It is a price drive towards the bottom market on the solar side, especially when we have areas where you're competing against lowest cost of energy in the 9 to 11 cent range. That can be a challenging market economically for some of these folks. So be aware of the or equals, that you're going to get a lower quality equipment, because I think my next slide, yeah, there you go. One small thing done incorrectly, 50,000 times. On a 100 megawatt site, someone's going to turn 1 million bolts. If those bolts aren't completely tightened, we know what our wind is here in Nebraska. What does that mean? Quality control, staying on top of it, making sure that program is efficient is very important. Those of you that have some construction background are going to be operating these types of sites, going to be working on construction crews, supervising construction crews. I can't stress this enough. Don't do your paperwork tomorrow. Do it yesterday. and then data management, just on the O&M side. So I'm going to talk batteries for just a second. SBP currently does not have that ancillary market for batteries. They do have it in some other areas of the country. We're seeing it have a large impact on some items. This gives you a sense. This is a national survey from SEPA, and it's a little bit dated. I think the numbers now have shifted about 10% towards the we're interested, and it's that combination of solar plus storage. What I'll tell you anecdotally is, as someone who does both owner's engineer and design in this space, 18 months ago, very few of the solar facilities we were involved with had energy storage. Today, every facility is planning, if they're not doing energy storage at the time they build the solar, it is being planned. We're putting in an extra circuit to add that battery system on later. It is being planned for. It's being planned for in their health and safety plans, in their fire plans, in their erosion plans, in their construction. It may be a pad at this point, but it's coming. It helps with a lot of things, and I do, if I remember right, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think SPP is actually doing a study for the ancillary market, and what would that mean? What are some of the finance mechanisms? So this is another one of those areas that, as solar develops in Nebraska, I think storage is going to become a bigger and bigger piece of that, or a component of that. With that, I think I'm good. Molly, you want to just sit back down? Was there anything I forgot?
Yeah, as a contractor and installer, there were a few things that I wanted to touch on that have really affected us over the last year. One is the ITC step down, as a lot of you know, so some of the tax credits are going to start going away at the end of this year. So a lot of projects are currently safe harboring, which means we started purchasing product, 9 months ago, just so we can get those full ITC tax credits. So if you're looking for a PPA or some kind of financing mechanism, that's something that's really important to understand, that some of those financial mechanisms are going to be going away over the next few years.
Yeah, so as a background on the wind side, the wind has already started to ramp down, and the PTC is kind of coming down. That now is happening on the solar side. This was the last year for 30%, then it goes to 26, then I think it's 22, and then it drops down to 10. So there is a window to capture that tax credit with this stuff. And so what we're seeing is I see a lot of panicked clients who are having trouble securing the quality products. And it is what it is. There's global limited manufacturing supply.
Yeah, and to give you an idea, right now, if I were to order racking tomorrow, if I put in a PO for racking, it would take me 22 weeks to get that on site. If I were to put in a PO for a transformer, it might be 24 to 26 weeks to get that on site. So we're seeing these really, really extended lead times on actual product. Yeah. And most of the tier 1 module manufacturers are out to Q2. So.
Yeah, well, and the modules are kind of interesting. You know, you've got, over time, modules have been dropping in price, and it probably drops about 20% every 3 months. That's been the trend for a long time. We've seen that tick back up. So where it was, if you were going to secure a gigawatt worth of panels, and there's a lot of mass orders right now, you might get 30 cents, and now we're seeing the quotes at 40 cents, and it's still a Q3 of 20 delivery. So with some of those manufacturers, and that's on top of the tariff that we have. So, you know, our federal government has placed tariffs on a lot of that equipment, and they continue, as the negotiations with China have not been going the way they've wanted them to go, they continue to ratchet that tariff up. That's a matter of business. It is what it is, but it impacts on those prices too. So,
and then on the positive side, the trend towards the 1500 volt systems is really exciting, and even higher voltage now if we can get to 250 kW inverters. That really does help counteract some of those tariffs. So last year we put in the first CPS 1500 volt systems in Grand Island. So it was the first in the US that they had turned on, so that was pretty exciting. And I think that's going to help counteract a lot of those price pushes that are going in the opposite direction.
Yep, absolutely. I think I just had some notes down, and I think I've got I think I hit most everything. Oh, actually, there was one thing that I forgot to talk about, and that was, I think yesterday some of the CEOs talked about resiliency and redundancy. One of my mentors in this industry, he does hydro, pump storage and hydropower. So he's the original renewable guy, and hasn't necessarily, I'll tell a funny story, hasn't necessarily appreciated me coming in as solar and wind renewables, because he has mechanical rotational energy, right? Similar to a fossil plant, and you have spinning reserve associated with those. You have mechanical inertia versus these, which are simply electrical inertia. These do create some grid stability issues in enough mass. Storage helps with that. Some of the new smart inverters help with that. But the laws of physics remain the laws of physics. And I think that's what Casey's talked about yesterday with some of his information. You've heard that from some of the CEOs. And that resiliency piece of that is an important piece of this future message as to why we do this and how it and what it means as we roll solar out into the system. Something to keep in the back of your head. Why are we actually doing this project? And does it meet the resiliency, reliability, carbon, whatever those goals are? So.
Yeah, and I think that goes to the whole question on distributed generation versus utility generation, and why certain munis are looking for resiliency and redundancy. If you have an old folks home or a hospital that goes offline because the whole grid is down, what do you do in that aspect? And how do we create systems that can balance all of the above while maintaining everything and making sure that, human life is being protected as well?
Questions? Do you want to take questions?
Yeah, sure.
Questions from the
Anybody have
audience?
questions?
Sure. I'll apologize. I do not hear very well, so if I ask you to repeat, just don't be offended. Just realize I'm deaf. Too much pile driving.
You had mentioned the Trump tariffs on solar. How much further ahead do you think the solar industry would be had those tariffs not been implemented?
Quite frankly, I think some of it's a red herring, but it does have an impact. Let me go and pull that slide up. There was a slide I had that was the sorry, I'll go back. Install, and it's clear back at the beginning. Sorry, guys. And you'll see a big jump, and then you see a big drop. There you go. That's where you're seeing. It's probably 2 gigawatt a year additional. But it would have been utility scale in the west and the southeast. I don't think that would have impacted Nebraska at all.
No, on the DG level, I don't think it affected that much. I think it's mostly the utility scale that ramped back on that.
Yeah, and what it is, you have some very large developers, and they go and they secure 2,000 megawatt, 2 gigawatt worth of panel, and then they build their annual program based upon that purchase. And some of that has been impacted, and so it has shifted that. And the reason I say it's a little bit of a red herring, part of this is you also have those big IOUs, you have some of the large utilities in the West that are saying, okay, we've got about 10 PPAs now, and we've been working with these guys for about 3-4 years. These really aren't that hard. I think we can do this. And so now they're starting to do them themselves. That's one of actually a big trend, and I neglected to mention, and I apologize for that. Historically, this market was driven similar to the wind market, where it was all PPA driven. You had a developer come in, they took all of the development risks, they took all the economic risks, and they would build it, and then they would sell it to a utility, and the utility would see a benefit from that. Right? And that's a model that we use here in Nebraska, in part because we're public power. In some of those other areas, you have IOUs that are private companies. They are needing to spend their capital dollars for return purposes. And so they are starting, instead of going the PPA route where they don't see the full benefit, they're willing to take some of that risk and develop themselves. Kind of goes to, as Nebraskans, we're not totally conservative, but we're fairly conservative, right, with our money, and we're pretty good with that. So the PPA route's still really a good way for us to go. But that's where you see a big bump too. because it has slowed that down. A lot of those IOUs, they have a period where instead of just buying the PPA and buying things that are ready to roll, they've taken a step back, and you kind of see this 12-month lag where they've been finding greenfields and figuring out what they're doing, and do they really want to do this? And usually there's a discussion with the board at some point on, is this a good investment or not? So that's an impact on some of that number too. It's not just the tariff. So, sorry.
You had on the California slide, excuse me, you had a note about time of use trends. Could you expand on that? What kind of trends or changes are you seeing there?
Sure. So California has gone in and they have changed what the PSC has gone in several rate studies, with several rate cases and several of the utilities. They have allowed the utilities to change their time of use. So you're a residential customer. For those of you that were here for the EV discussion yesterday, and Scott with LES showed that charging. You know, people come home, they plug in their car, it tends to charge. You know, some of them start charging about 7, charge until 11, then it kind of comes back down. In California, they now have changed their rate structures, so the most expensive power is the power you use. They've actually changed those between 4 and 7, 4 and 8. And the cheapest power is between 2 and 6 in the morning. So everybody's programming their stuff to run between 2 and 6 in the morning to balance out the loads. That's what's going on. But in the solar space, if the demand is shifting to 2 in the morning, you know, solar's not going to play in that market because the sun doesn't shine. So then you need a battery. So that changes that economic profile of that project. The other big scenario that I see with that is conversely, if I can produce power during peak periods, during those times, I, as the producer, as the IPP or the private or the net meter holder, I receive a better rate. So if I put something out, instead of getting 11 like I do the normal time, I get 15 because I'm helping the utility with that. So it's both. It's both a push-pull in that system. Does that help? Okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
Wait 1 second. Well, I was just going to say, in Nebraska, there's not a lot of time of use charges, but there are on-peak versus off-peak charges, especially for the wholesale or unique customers. So it's a similar concept, but not quite the same. Go ahead.
You mentioned the different impacts of wind and solar on the local economy where you build a project, the differences in O&M. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Obviously, there are fewer landowners in solar, but what are the impacts in terms of jobs and job quality and other factors like that that you see as different between wind and solar?
Yeah, so what I would, rather than me spitting out a bunch of information that may be inaccurate, what I'm going to instead say is there are some really good studies out there. I think E.R. Thompson actually has one. He did one recently for wind for a solar project here in Nebraska. I know they've done them for wind, so I would encourage you to get those and look at those. Because something done by an economist is something much better than me spouting off up here, quite truthfully. What I'll tell you, what I will say is from a jobs standpoint, both have good technical jobs, both have good paying jobs, similar O&M expertise needed, similar quantities of jobs needed. It's the frequency duration that you may see. So a wind facility may have somebody who comes in and comes out, and when there's a fix-it ticket, right? On the solar side, some of those small facilities, it's a similar scenario. Some of those large facilities, there may be a full-time person on site, and they're spending all day out there just going through and checking the equipment. On a large wind facility, you'll have the same thing, but it's a slightly different skill set, right? They're doing the same thing, but one's more mechanical, one's more electrical.
So as an O&M contractor in the state of Nebraska, I have to say that vegetation management is the #1 biggest issue, especially on former cornfields or sites where there's a lot of fertilized ground. We get pigweed that sprays everywhere. And so for the first 3 years, it can be pretty much a hassle to try and keep some of that down. Because when you go into a cornfield, you've got to basically just, till it make it flat, do all of that, and then you're planting your seed, but the grass doesn't always take for the first few years. And so that is
the most difficult thing that we run into is just trying to keep
And that's,
the pigweed out.
and that's real typical no matter where you are in the country. I've got some great photos of a site in West Texas that it hadn't rained for 2 years and it rained and man, they had a mess, right? Because all they did was they went in and they brush hogged all the mesquite and they didn't actually sterilize it. And so when they got one rain, all of a sudden the mesquite came back and up through the panels and then they have a mess on their hands because they have an operating facility. Have stuff in the southeast, and kudzu is the issue in the southeast. It grows like mad. It's almost impossible to kill and working through it. So yeah, great point.
But we have tractors now, so that's kind of fun.
So you just partially answered one of my questions about O&M. So vegetation control, what are some of the other main O&M tasks at the solar site besides that?
We get jackrabbits that sometimes chew on wires. It's just little things like that. It's never really a major equipment failure. It's always just making sure that there's not animals burrowing in a hole or.
Yeah. A lot of the things you can take care of during design. In some parts of the country, snakes and rodents are a legitimate issue in these facilities. When I'm in West Texas, one of the comments that I ask is, have you lost any inverters to snakes? It's a fair question, and yeah, we periodically do. But through some of the design and construction practices, you can minimize some of that. But if you're someone who doesn't understand that, it can be, you can miss things, right? And another thing I see a lot, we get called out to an awful lot of, by some of the utilities, facilities they've taken possession of for drainage. Whether it is facilities that have been around long enough that they need the ditches cleaned out or things aren't draining correctly. In the West, there's some erosion issues similar to the sandhills, right? You have real sandy, silty soils. They're highly erosive. Once you start something, you really got to get ahead of it. We have similar problems with that. That's something to be aware of. The site needs to be stable when it goes into operation so we can avoid the erosion issues. With everything.
Yeah, and we really got tested this year with all the flooding that occurred throughout Nebraska with systems. And, if you have that foundation, if you build them right, they'll survive. But, this year was definitely a test.
Thoughtful, sustainable planning. When you think of driving 300,000 fence posts into the ground for a solar project, you don't necessarily think of what is the impact of sheet flow water running over that site. Those of you who are farmers understand the impact of that on your site, but it's a lot of contractors don't necessarily because they mass grade and they completely stabilize rather than long-term consequence. Whether it is vegetation management through the use of sheep, not goats, whether it's sheep, whether it is what you're selecting for your vegetation, whether it is we use a lot of pollinators in certain areas where they've had bee colonization collapse. We use that on the perimeters. We'll use that as part of the beautification of the perimeters per se. Making sure you're dealing with some animal control, some of those things, they all matter. So I'll turn it back over to John. Okay.